Well, Hank, you and I talked a little bit earlier today about, on our first segment, about crisis management. I'd like to take little deeper dive into that if we can. Um, One of the things is, how many different types of crisis are there? I mean, I mentioned when we touched on it briefly earlier about some people manage on a crisis basis day to day, and that's not what we're really talking about, is it?
No, I mean, the crises have to do with um, keeping the crisis from happening. I mean, a crisis for a small business can have to do with the core business. You know, things have changed, their marketplace has changed, and they're maybe not willing to admit it. And then the rest of their business may be running just fine. You know, it's just that, um, you know, it's going to be different for every business. A crisis isn't just the same thing. Um, when, for example, uh, a small business is going to lose market share, it's from the very beginning. Once you're successful, there's only one way to go. That's down, unless you think past the next crisis and you move it around. And in this era of companies combining resources all the time, they've just got to think a little more outside the box. They don't always, you know.
Well, and the thing interesting again, and I mentioned this just briefly earlier, and it's always been a major concern of mine of working in the small business world and then mentoring and advising small businesses is a lot of these crises. We know the potentials there, such as I mentioned,
Yeah.
storms here in
Hmm.
the Gulf Coast area, but we don't do anything, or we do very little to prepare our businesses for the inevitably you're going to have or you're going to be affected. It may be a big effect, such as the business flooded. I had a client whose business flooded in Harvey, yet they were back in business within 24 hours. They happened to be an IT support firm, and all of their clients scattered all over Houston. Not one of them was down for 1 minute, other than internet interruptions, which they have
Hmm.
no control over. But they had prepared their clients
Hmm.
as far as the IT part of their business
Yeah.
to be continuously available, which I thought that was a great milestone for that business to do that.
And those kind of businesses that are in the logistics business, their whole thing is not letting somebody down, always being there now and in the future. One of the crises, the more I'm thinking about it, there's the kinds of crisis. The first ones are from doing nothing. I wrote a book about that years ago called The High Cost of Doing Nothing. And it takes the premise that American business spends 6 times more than it should every year cleaning up mistakes. There's that much inherent in the system. And there are whole professions, can we say, environmental remediation, people like that. Their whole reason for being is to take care of inevitable crises that happened when you do nothing. And then the next level of crisis that frequently happens in business is just doing everything the way you've always done it. Uh, I made the observation. I've had 5,000 clients over the years. Some of them are very large corporations, many of them small businesses. And after the recession of 2008, 2009, a lot of businesses, I made the observation that maybe 25% of those that went out of business probably should have, because they were already obsolete when the crisis struck. Same thing for Harvey. It's the good ones that realize that they're in the business of being there for their stakeholders always. Then you get into the crises that businesses bring on themselves. They'll try to cover up a lawsuit. They'll try to cover up an incident that occurred. They'll diss the wrong customer who then goes on the internet and posts bad things. It's kind of like things of their own making. Then you get into crises that occur due to no fault of their own. They're losing suppliers. Uh, One of the worst things for a large small business is to realize that everybody that they use as a vendor, as a supplier, as an outside resource, needs to have the same commitment to standards, because those people outside of our purview are going to say and do things that are totally wrong. And then, then you get into the crises that occur through bad work, poor workmanship. What percentage of the products that you make is defective going in? What percentage of this of the the pills on the market are tainted? When I worked back in the 1980s, I had a client, Johnson & Johnson, and we had the Tylenol tragedy, where a handful of pills were contaminated by somebody bad who was trying to cause some trouble. But the way we worked that crisis was to modify what was going on, recognize what we needed to do. Then we immediately started going and trying to rebuild confidence. One of our top publics that we were after was the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. We tried to leverage the positive, proactive, concerned coverage that we got by the media. Oh, these people are good people, and they're trying to, what we were trying to do was just get our future objectives. We utilized the attention to get the tamper-proof caplet introduced by the FDA, who we had been fighting. I say we, anytime I talk about the client, it's we. We'd been fighting them for 3 years to get the tamper-proof. Had the tamper-proof caplet been approved, we tried in the media coverage not to go out and say, we told you so. If you'd only let this happen, we tried to do it in a responsible manner. And would that other companies would do that. At the time, it was the right thing to do, and it set examples for good crisis management. When you see recent crises, can we say spills of chemicals on the Houston Ship Channel? Can we say bad handling of transportation companies who ruin lots of product? And for them to just say, we uphold great standards, show us that you do it. And there's no substitute for communicating back with your stakeholders. And a small business, let's say they have a crisis of some kind during the year. The way they write that letter to their stakeholders of this is how we believe we responsibly handled the crisis. So it's all those kinds of things. What, of course, magnifies the crisis is when a company does nothing, the wrong things, they lie, they say, oh, well, no, we're fine in every way. One of the things that perplexes me as an expert on business and crisis management is when I see these statements posted on TV. We always adhere to this, that, or the other. They never address how they handled the current crisis. Those companies who will honestly communicate, this is what we saw, this is what we learned, this is what we did. That's what Johnson & Johnson did with Tylenol, and that's why the Tylenol case was in such a good example. Shortly after that tainted product case, I had another client of mine, Girl Scouts of America. Well, when you tamper with Girl Scout cookies, you're tampering with America. And we were able to contain and codify what happened. It was through that process I learned that every flavor of Girl Scout cookies is manufactured by different factories in different locations, most of them women-owned businesses. That's a good thing. But what I learned is how you respond says volumes about your future to go off and do business.
Well, and there's no doubt about that. Well, let's back up for a second. Okay, I'm listening to the program today. Give me an idea of how to put a crisis management plan, preparedness plan together, so I can, after the show, take some time and identify potential crisis, look inwardly, as you mentioned, like bad workmanship. How do we put a plan together?
It's a part of the strategic plan. It should never be done. It's the same thing that happens when companies run into, some crisis having to do with ethics or diversity. All of that is part of the strategic plan, and it's labeled as such, the crisis portion of the plan. The foolhardy thing to do is to write a plan that never acknowledges what the crises can be. So you predict in each of the major areas, core business, running the business, financial, people, and business development, and then where the organization is going to go, who it's going to work with outside. You need to address all of that. You need to have deadlines. You know, people talk about a strategic plan. Is a strategic plan a mission statement? That's usually the last thing you write. A mission statement and $3 will buy you a cup of coffee. It's not the main part of the plan. It's the executive summary after the fact. You need to really look at your goals, your objectives, and your tactics. The tactics, seemingly the bullet point, within the plan is the most important part of the plan. And if you really look at your tactics and how you're going to measure, how soon are you going to respond to every crisis? And that could be a disgruntled customer service call. Every customer service call will be answered within a period of X number of minutes or hours, not days. So it all comes down to setting timelines, setting accountability to where everybody involved in the process is going to be held accountable. It's one of the things that my friends in small business, why I admire small business so much, and I feel the same way about nonprofit organizations, because they're small business like also. Everybody has jobs. Everybody has responsibilities. Everybody plays a role in the crisis. It's not like you've got large hallways full of people that you can shrug it off and say, oh, that's someone else's problem. So the secret is to make everybody accountable for their part of the crisis within budget, within timeline, and within safety standards. I mean, you need to address all of that in the plan.
And it's all custom because it's every business, every industry is different, I would assume. Just for a second, let's point out to people, and I look at this as an encouragement, but in your opinion, what are some of the liabilities on a company for not handling their crisis properly? Okay, I've got a workmanship issue. We can take something real simple, a small business, where I've got a workmanship problem and I send product out and it's defective. What are some of those liabilities that I could face as a small business that I need to really think about as I work through this process?
They're going to lose market share. It's going to spark lawsuits. One of your measurements of a good effectiveness crisis preparedness plan. I'm not just talking about crisis management now. It's crisis preparedness. And one of your goals is to avoid lawsuits and understand what they could be to know what you're going to avoid. The other thing about the costs would be what are going to be your costs of cleaning up bad work? What about rework? How many times do you have to go back to the customer and say, we messed up again, sorry? How many sorries will the customer accept before they go elsewhere? And then you get into the damage control issue. Damage control is not shrugging your shoulders and looking the other way. And that, frankly, is what happened with some of those chemical spills on the Gulf recently. It was too easy to say, we're looking into it. That's not an action. That's a rationale. And then you get into what your recovery and restoration is going to be. Are you going to have to rebuild structures? Are you going to have to rebuild economies of neighboring cities? We're going to be seeing lawsuits coming out of those programs for many years to come, unfortunately. Then you get into the retooling. When you reconstruct a business after Harvey, a natural disaster, or after a financial meltdown, as we had in 2008, 2009, your costs of rebuilding are going to be infinitely more than just restoring. In the book, Big Picture Business, actually in volume 1, there are 3 chapters that address those issues of how the economy had to transform and reorganize itself. And it was more than just, bailing out the auto industry. It wasn't just a simple, if you do this, all else will be well. You had to talk about the trades professions that were really hurt as a result of that. So there's a domino effect, and you think of your worst. It's what I frequently say is you prepare for the worst, you can expect the best, but if you've prepared for the worst, you're going to come closer to getting to your ideal opportunity. And then you get into those opportunity costs. What about lost business? Let's say I made some observations of during Hurricane Harvey. What about that lost inventory that all those auto dealers had of flooded out cars? How many of those got palmed off on unsuspecting people later? Maybe not through them, but through someone else. And what about those companies that kept their employees on the payroll until such time as the business could recover? That's good. That's the right thing to do. That gets you good reviews on the internet when you do that. But it really is the right thing to do if you're going to stay in business. You know, there's four kinds of businesses, and you recognize that the crises are a little different for each of them. Number one is you create a new mousetrap. You've got a service that no one else has, and you're going to really push forward and do your best job. Then you get into that second category of company that's going to take what the mousetrap inventor did and take it further. You know, there's companies, there's a well-known restaurant chain, Pappas. They take other people's restaurant concepts and they make them really good, and they keep the customer service, and they're doing a lot of the right things. And then you look at whose ideas they took and amplified upon were the mistakes of others. Then you get into that third category of companies that aren't supposed to be around forever. You know, we're nurturing an asset for a certain number of years so that we can sell as a roll-up. I had a client a few years ago. They were a chain of ambulatory surgical centers, and we were basically preparing them. They thought of themselves, I thought of them as a Category 3 company. And we were putting a chain of them together, and the more we got into it, we were going to sell to a company called Health South, which started having corporate crises. So we thought, fine, we'll keep the asset, we'll acquire other companies, we'll do a roll-up, we'll go public. And we took them public as Orion Healthcare. We took potential crises over the company we were trying to sell our company to, and we turned it into a positive, and we kept it, and we held on to it. And then that fourth area is companies that, how shall I say, they're not real companies, they're ideas, they're concepts. You know, some of these internet companies that you think you're doing business with are roll-ups of other ideas taken from someone else. There's room for all four, and there's crises that can occur with all four. One of those Category 4 that I just mentioned is one of these online network providers, and where they got into trouble recently because the vendors that were providing the services, they're an online app is what their business is. They're a marketing company, but they started getting a lot of grief for the providers of the service that they were advertising. And then what was the real crisis? Their stock price plunged. Can we say Uber? You know, there are a lot of current examples where you don't necessarily have control over the downstream crises, but you sure get the grief for other people creating them.
Well, and that's a function of connection and how much your business is connected to outsiders where you don't really have that much control.
OneBestConsult.com, a community of small business owners where you as an owner can find answers to the most pressing business questions you have. Not sure who to turn to when you have a challenge in your business? Turn to the folks at OneBestConsult.com. That's the number one, bestconsult.com, where you can always find advice you can use based on common sense business experience. Join our community of like-minded business owners at OneBestConsult.com.